it makes a lot of sense to me, Xavi, that people pay attention to climate change because it is so evident, it's so vivid. I mean, we feel it in front of us, right? Heat waves in the summer, fires in Australia, fires in California, many people dying of overheating, of heat exhaustion, things like that. Those things we see very dramatically in front of us. But perhaps climate change is obviously the sexiest of all global environmental changes, but it's not the only one, and perhaps probably not the most critical one. Biological diversity is really critical because of the reasons I mentioned, and also, Xavi, biological loss, biological extinction is an irreversible problem, basically.
Bienvenido, Rodolfo. I'm joined today by Professor Rodolfo Dirzo, the Professor of Biology and Earth System Sciences at Stanford University. Rodolfo's scientific work examines the study of species interactions in tropical ecosystems from California, Latin America, and other tropical areas of the world. And his recent research highlights the decline of animal life and how this affects ecosystem processes, services, and regulation. Thank you so much for joining me, Rodolfo.
A pleasure, Javi. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure, and I'm happy to be interacting in this conversation with you.
Absolutely. So look, a very simple question to start with, or maybe it isn't simple, but I wanted to ask you how you became the person you are, being a maverick in the field of biology. What is your story, and how did you arrive at the current position you are?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a long story, but I can try and summarize it. I was born in southern Mexico, and the area that I used to live at the time, it had the incredible situation for me now, as I see it in retrospect, that there was still some remainings of tropical dry forest in that area. And as a child, I used to go out and enjoy those beautiful forests and climb trees and chase insects and find fruit from native trees and native species and so on. And I guess that created some sort of a fascination into me, the typical thing that we call biophily, your affection and innate predisposition to be a nature lover. And that was a very significant aspect of the development in the psyche of my passion and appreciation for nature. It just happened that at the time there was, in the local state, there was a university that had an area of biology. And so, I said, well, perhaps this passion that I feel for nature, to being out and trying to understand things, can be studied in a very systematic and organized manner. So I decided to join the School of Biological Sciences and take the area of biology with an emphasis in ecology. And then, Xavi, the fact that I began to see that there was some structure and organization to the things that I was passionate about, that you could actually study them in a systematic and organized manner in the science of ecology and environmental sciences, became a fascination to me. And so I went to complete my undergrad and my master's and my PhD in ecology. At the level of the PhD, I studied as an evolutionary ecologist. I wanted to understand how come that plants and animals co-evolve together, right? I mean, how can we understand that, for example, plants can be as surprising to us as, for example, with things such as being capable of producing very complicated chemical compounds, such as the capacity to release cyanide, hydrogen cyanide, that gas that is a lethal gas. Well, some plants actually produce that when they're damaged physically on their leaves. And I wanted to understand what were the evolutionary pressures that led those plants to do those amazing things, such as producing cyanide. So I was studying the ecology and evolution of plants and animals as they interact together from the evolutionary perspective. And then when I finished my PhD in the UK, I went back to Mexico, and I wanted to apply all of that knowledge in tropical ecosystems. And I was studying the ecology of a tropical rainforest in Veracruz, southern Mexico. But very soon, by being physically there, present for multiple years, living physically in that field station, I began to notice peculiar things, such as, for example, I could hear, the sound of shotguns sometimes in the evenings. Sometimes I discovered some people carrying some dead animals there. Sometimes I found some people that were carrying, for example, monkeys, doing really illegal hunting and illegal poaching. And I talked to those people, and it was a range of responses that I got. Some people for commercial purposes, some other people because they wanted to capture these monkeys for biomedical research. And then I began to notice that despite the fact that I was living in this field station, and you could see the green of the station, plants, exuberant forests, and so on, I began to notice that there was a clear absence of some animals. This idea of the empty forest, this syndrome of the empty forest began to sort of click in my head. How come that this place that is a field station, it's a reserve, it looks beautiful from the green point of view, it's just a mega salad and is not being used by animals that should be eating these plants. And so that sort of clicked an interest in my thinking as an ecologist in trying to understand what is happening to places that look okay, but they might be missing the animal component. And that connects to another interesting experience, Xavi, which is the fact that, nowadays we can use this amazing technology of satellite imagery, remote sensing tools, and you can actually see from the space what is the condition of the vegetation. Imagine that you take an image at a given time, and you go back to that site and take an image at a later time, and you can actually measure with precision how much of the forest, how much of the plant life has been diminished. But you cannot do that when you try to do the same thing with animal life. And so this metric that we use in ecology and conservation, which is the deforestation, which you can measure via satellite imagery, I wanted to have a term, a word that would imply the same problem, but from the point of view of animal life, from the point of view of the fauna. So I decided to use the term defaunation, like an equivalent to the word deforestation that everybody understands. If you take a cab in Sydney or wherever and you talk to the driver, I am working on deforestation, that person will understand what you're talking about. But it's very difficult to convey the same idea in terms of the wildlife, in terms of the fauna. So I came up with this term, defaunation. And I've been spreading that word, and I've been trying to sort of popularize that word to inculcate the perception that animal life is also being impacted dramatically. And so I developed this field of ecology, which is conservation ecology with an emphasis in wildlife that I call defaunation. And so that's a kind of a long story, made it in a relatively short description for you, going from my initial motivation to be jumping and climbing trees and chasing insects to being preoccupied about what is happening with animal life that we sometimes ignore because it's not easy to detect from a technical point of view. And that led me to engage in very active research in the field by actually doing a number of things that would allow me to calculate the magnitude of the problem of loss of animal life, defaunation. This is what I do today.
Wow, incredible. Thank you so much, Rodolfo, for condensing your life story in such a way that also incorporates very informative information. To your point on defaunation, I thought I would just very quickly read a few statistics which I've gathered on the declining animal populations.
Yeah.
So there's a great article, The Guardian, that I'm going to link in the description of the podcast video. But it looks at the region of Latin America. It looks at different regions across the world in terms of animal population decline since the 1970s. Yeah. So across the world, since 1970 up into 2018, when the data was recorded, the world's animal populations had declined 69%.
Yeah.
And that's an average across all regions. So if we focus onto the specific regions now, Europe and Central Asia have declined by 18%, North America by 20%, Asia by 55%, and then frighteningly, Africa by 66%. Yeah. And then Latin America, the place that you speak about as home, I mean, Mexico in particular, where defaunation is hearing, and you heard the empty forest, it's declined by 94%.
Yeah.
So this is not to be mistaken with extinction. This is animal population decline, right?
Correct.
So,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, to me, when I saw this number, I couldn't even really compute what that would have meant. And speaking as an Australian, where we are known for being one of the most ecologically diverse countries in the world with incredible fauna and flora. To me, this was incredibly troubling because it is the nature, the environmental factors that, in a sense, are indicative of our history, of our evolutionary history, and our interaction with nature. But to focus on a few things. So you did your PhD, your undergrad, and your master's in ecology. And I think on a general level, people understand ecology involves nature. But just before we dive into our next question, can you briefly help us understand what is ecology? And then why is it so? And what would happen if animals stop being present in these habitats, in these forests, these locations?
Yeah. So, Xavi, there's a lot of critical material that you mentioned, and might be useful for the people who are going to be listening to our conversation. To unpack a little bit of that. So, first of all, crucial point that you mentioned, those statistics, those numbers there, refer to the decline in the abundance of species in given populations. So, for example, charismatic animals that will be very easy for people to associate their interest and preoccupation for: elephants, zebras, orangutans, and so on. Those are declining their numbers dramatically, very, very dramatically, almost going to the collapse, and yet the species is not extinct yet. So that is critical because some people say, well, those animals are not extinct from the face of the earth. But what is happening is the decline of the population dramatically, to the point, Xavi, that in some areas that used to have, say, elephants in the past, they are completely gone. So that population there in that location is gone, although the elephant might be persistent in another population. The species are still cataloged as being present, not extinct, but we have detected dramatic extinction of the populations of the species. And imagine the situation for the people who are listening to us. If you have a business, an ecotourism business in this location, if the elephants disappear in this location, for you, that's a critical issue because your elephants are not there. You cannot maintain an ecotourism business there, despite the fact that the elephant might be present somewhere else. So the crisis that we see today in terms of biological extinction is not necessarily the global extinction of the species, but the extinction of the local populations as a result of the declines in the abundance that you mentioned. One more thing that is relevant to unpack, in a paper that I published in 2014, we used the same metric that you mentioned to calculate those values of decline that you referred to. We calculated that at the time, tropical areas had a decline for the vertebrates of about 50%. So that's 2014. And now the most recent statistic that you mentioned, 2018, basically getting close to the present times, the numbers have increased on average to almost 70%, 69%. That says that, from when we published that paper, which was already a terrible number, very dramatic declines, with tropical areas losing the abundance of the vertebrates in 50% in the last 4 decades. Now, in the last 5 decades, the numbers have gone even worse. So unfortunately, we have to convey to the people who listen to us that this is a problem which is being accelerated, most unfortunately. And the last thing that is important to mention there is that, as you very correctly said, this is not a homogeneous phenomenon. It happens with different intensities in different parts of the world. And perhaps the thing that is critical to clarify is that some parts of the planet, for example, the US or Europe, those numbers might not be so dramatic, but that is explained in part because there has already been a major problem of defaunation there, to the point that it's no longer possible to see more defaunation because there's almost nothing to be defauned. Right. Go back to Latin America or Africa, where you still have good numbers of individuals in different species. and those are declining. There you see their numbers are so high because they still have some numbers for us to record to be the rates of decline compared to areas that might seem that they're not in big trouble because the rates of decline are much lower. But that in part is explained by the fact that those areas have already lost populations. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. All of this, Xavi, is an ecological problem, so it's worth explaining what ecology is about. So in very simple terms, when I was in kindergarten, or when you were in kindergarten, or basically in your elementary education, we used to have the term ecology is the study of organisms in their environment. So oikos meaning home, logos meaning the science of or the study of, right? So that was a simple definition that we used. Now we tend to think of ecology as the scientific study of the abundance and distribution of the species in their natural habitats. So that's ecology. How come that we have, that we have elephants in Africa and we don't have elephants now in North America? How come that we have roses and daisies in some locations in those natural numbers and not in other places? What are the forces that maintain the numbers of individuals in local populations and in the geographic distribution? That is sort of the essence of ecology. How can organisms live and maintain the populations under a given set of ecological or environmental conditions and maintain themselves through time, right? So that's ecology. And hence, these problems of conservation biology have to do with ecology because we're seeing the decline in the numbers in the local populations and also the changes in the geographic distribution, which is ecology. And that idea of the changes in the geographic distribution, Xavi, has led us to understand that for many species, there is a problem of shrinkage or reduction or restriction of the geographic distribution. So elephants, let's suppose the elephants covered this distribution in the past. Now the distribution is like this and perhaps in little patches here and there. So clearly a problem that has to do with the abundance and distribution of the species, i.e. ecology. Okay?
Yep, fantastic. No, thank you for, first of all, unpacking the information, the statistics that I provided, and then also going into detail about ecology. I think it's very important to understand what ecology is and having these fundamental principles, because if people outside the fields of environmental sciences and biology don't understand them, we may be doomed to repeat mistakes that are currently occurring today, and are trying to understand fundamental principles such as I think E.O. Wilson's idea of reducing the size of an area equals increased rates of extinction, which is very intuitive and is empirically researched, right? So I just wanted to add on a point that you were mentioning about declining populations and see if I'm understanding you correctly as well. Although the declining in population rates are not extinction rates, by having a declining population, certain groups of species increasingly have higher risks of extinction because their rates of replication will be much lower. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's correct, and the situation is like this. Imagine that you have a population in a given location. Let's suppose that you have a given number of jaguars in a tropical rainforest in the Amazon or in Central America, right? If the area where these jaguars live, say a tropical forest in Southeast Mexico or in Guatemala or in Costa Rica or in Brazil, for reasons that have to do with anthropogenic impact, land use change, the area is reduced to a smaller size, then the jaguars, there might be some jaguars still there, but you have a problem that those species need a certain number of individuals to maintain viable populations. Viable populations is a term that has to do with the genetics. We need for all the species a certain degree of genetic variation. An example would be illustrative of the situation. Royal families in the past, particularly in the past, used to marry within the same family, right? So kings and princesses and queens and so on. And we saw in history many genetic problems with those. For example, problems of hemophilia, problems of fingers missing in the hands, and a number of problems that we call inbreeding. That is to say, mixing your genes within your closely related persons, right? Your cousins, your sisters, and so on. That was an incredible case of inbreeding. Well, natural populations have the same problem. They need to have a given number of individuals so that the reproduction is not within closely related individuals. You don't want to marry your cousin or your sister because some of the genes that might be not good for some particular trait, say a disease, get together when the marriage is within closely related individuals. Some genetic models indicate that for you to maintain a viable population, to avoid the problems of inbreeding, right, you need to have at least 50 individuals. So that there's a possibility of you finding a partner that is not your close related member of your family. But say jaguars, elephants, big animals need, for them to maintain a population of 50 animals, you cannot maintain 50 animals in an area like this. You need a which is much larger than that. As we see the rates of reforestation reducing the area, even though the species might still there, the individuals might be there, the chances then that they are going to be interbreeding within members of the same families, right, are going to be so increased that very soon we'll begin to see those problems of inbreeding as we saw in the royal families in the past. So that is a problem that has to do with deforestation, the reduction of the habitat, and then even though the species is not extinct, demographically and genetically, those species are actually doomed to extinction because of the inbreeding depression and things like that. One clever ecologist, a clever colleague, Dan Jansen, talks about those individuals as the living dead. Those are jaguars or pumas that are living there, they're breeding, they're running, they can jump and so on, but genetically and demographically, they're doomed, they're dead. Some of the people call them zombie species because you have the individuals there, but unfortunately, given the reduction of the habitat, the probability of finding a partner and the probability of finding a partner that is not your relative is dramatically reduced. There's more of the habitat that you have.
Yeah, and is it also true that given the reduction of genetic diversity, that also means that if there's a certain event, let's say environmental catastrophe or a new species gets involved in invasive species, because the species are more homogeneous, the likelihood of adapting is much less likely because they all share very similar DNA. Is that right, or would that have to be over much larger timescales?
No, it can happen in a very short time. So this is a principle that actually Darwin came up with. For natural selection and adaptation to occur, the first ingredient that you need is for there to be variation. So that when an environmental challenge occurs, if you have only one type of genetic makeup, right, if that genetic makeup does not fit the new change in the environment, so a place becoming hotter because of climate change, a place becoming smaller because of deforestation, then that species with that level of genetic variation is not going to be able to survive. But if you have multiple individuals, chances are you're increasing the probability that some genetic variants of that population might have the appropriate genes for them to be able to cope with a new environmental change. So it's a question of variability to be able to be prepared for you to deal with possible changes. And as we know, Xavi, one aspect of life on this planet is that it's a very dynamic. We're always changing, right? In the past, it used to be one single continent, Pangea, then it broke apart into different continents. You imagine the cataclysmic changes that occur with that, right? And an easier way for people to perceive the situation. There is seasonality. There's dry season and wet season in many parts. There's cold season and warm season. Well, all of those changes occur, and you need to have the capacity, the genetic capacity to withstand, to accommodate to those changes, because change is a fact of life. Even in huge, gigantic spans of time, millions of years, also within short times. Here's an interesting lesson to understand this question of even the short times, Xavi. With this problem of defaunation, in the case of Africa, in some populations of elephants, given this horrendous activity of us, Homo sapiens, which is the poaching and killing of elephants for the ivory trade, in which we use the tusks of the elephants, right? Kill the elephants, take the tusks for the ivory trade. If you're a person who does that kind of an activity, you want to go for the elephants that have larger tusks, right? This is what is going to be your attraction to you. Well, it happened that with this incredible proliferation of the ivory trade, these persons involved in that activity are selectively killing the elephants that have larger tusks, not killing the elephants that for some reason are tuskless or have shorter tusks. Now we see in some populations in Africa that the predominant genotype, the predominant type of elephant that is becoming much more abundant in the local population are the ones that have very short or have no tusks. You can see that in a very short time, in a few decades, we are operating as a selective pressure, eliminating the typical elephant that you see with a beautiful large tusk, because we prefer those. So the elephant that have the genes that code for tusks not to be so large, those are the ones that are surviving now. So you can see there are sort of contemporary, recent evolution, in this case, driven by us, by the activities that we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a kind of a general message that comes from this is that conservation or the lack of conservation or the impact that we do on nature also has effect not only in the ecology and functioning of ecosystems, but also in the evolutionary processes, right?
Yeah.
The situation of the elephants illustrates this evolutionary change.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a fantastic book on the ecological history of Australia called The Future Eaters, which I highly recommend. And they talk about how the first Australians, the indigenous population, when it was migrating from Asia, the author theorizes that by selecting they were living in islands, and so their predominant source of nutrition was fish. And the author posits that a few 100,000 years or several thousand years ago, the hunters would have hunted the biggest fish, and says that possibly they would have selected out larger fish phenotypes, if I'm understanding you correctly, and consequently it meant that there were smaller fish, which I thought was quite interesting. But nevertheless, I think I wanted to touch on a quick story. So and perhaps I can let you tell it. It's about the wolves in a Yellowstone forest. And so maybe for context, I think before I recently took a ecology class at university, my first ecology class, which was fantastic. But before that, my understanding of deforestation was very limited and not really involving much complexity. And it was in those classes where I learned about a very simple idea, and yet for some reason I hadn't come across it yet, called trophic cascading. Now, I think this is very important to people that don't have much understanding of environmental sciences, to understand that for deforestation and then consequently defaunation to be occurring, it is not as simple as forests are sort of reducing and plants are reducing. It's sort of a linear impact. Removing one tree means maybe one species is being removed. It is much, much more complex than that. And I think the case of the Yellowstone forest of the story is a really great example. And would you like to tell that story, Professor?
Yeah, and if I may, Xavi, I would like to complement that story with another story of my own research.
Yes, please.
The phenomenon of trophic cascades. As the term implies, when we do an interruption of the food chain, of the organization of animals and plants in an ecosystem, which we call the food chain, because you have the plants that are the food for the herbivores that eat the plants. Those herbivores are the food for the carnivores that eat those herbivores. Those carnivores are the food that for the second level carnivores that eat the carnivores that eat the herbivores that eat the plants. So imagine when you remove one of those, you break the chain and create a cascade, a multiplicity of factors that come into play once you remove those kinds of situations. The case of Yellowstone is emblematic because for reasons that have to do with human activities in this place, Yellowstone, we humans eliminated the wolves, right? We eliminated the wolves and then the big herbivores. Let's imagine for people to visualize the situation, the elk, the deer, those kinds of animals. In the absence of the top predators, the wolves, those animals and the herbivores began to expand in the population. So we removed the control of those herbivores. These herbivores began to increase in abundance, and in so doing, they began to have a much stronger impact on the vegetation, right? Imagine more deer, more elk, more big herbivores in a given location. The trampling that they do, the grazing that they do is going to impact the vegetation at a much higher level than when the wolves were present, right? So those changes in the vegetation in turn affect the other aspects of the environment. Let's suppose that many of those plants that used to be present in big numbers close to river creeks, right? Close to river beds, which we call riparian ecosystems. Now they're overgrazed by these animals. Then the quality and quantity of the water that used to be running through those creeks and rivers is changed dramatically because of the overexploitation of the plants, because of the hyperabundance of the herbivores, and also the compaction of the soil and so on. So you see that removing the wolves has a cascade of consequences that percolates into multiple aspects of the environment. So let me see for people who might live in other parts of the world, for them to have another example to see the sort of the general principles that are behind the trophic cascades. In Africa, where we are studying defaunation, we have uncovered that in areas where we humans have removed the big herbivores of a place and the carnivores. So imagine the savanna from which we remove the elephants, giraffe, zebras, buffaloes, and so on. You would expect a number of phenomena to occur. And indeed, what we have illustrated that happens is that in the absence of these animals, the grasses begin to become much more exuberant, much more abundant. The shrubs begin to be much more abundant as well. If the shrubs and grasses begin to be much more abundant, then for the small animals, the rats and mice and squirrels and chipmunks that live at ground level, now they're more protected because the predators, the avian predators, don't see them. So they begin to increase in abundance, the small animals. At the same time, because there are more grasses and more shrubs, there are more seeds and more leaves for these little animals to increase in abundance. At the same time, the acacia trees that used to being eaten, the fruits eaten by the elephants and giraffes and so on, are no longer eaten by those. And so all of the seeds of these acacia trees fall down to the ground. And so these small animals, the rodents and chipmunks and rats and so on, are more protected. They have now more seeds to feed on. And also, because you don't have the big animals, the compaction of the soil is not as hard, it's much softer. Now you have much more, you facilitate for the small rodents to do the burrows in places and so on. If you increase the numbers of rodents, you increase the ectoparasites that they carry, the fleas and ticks and so on. If you increase the number of rodents, you increase the number of ticks. And if you increase the number of ticks, then you increase the number of diseases that these ticks and the rodents carry. Leptospira, leishmania, plague, and so on and so forth. If you increase those numbers, the probabilities of humans coming into contact with these rodents that are becoming much more abundant now and carry all of these diseases, chances are that you, human, might be infected by those because of the contact with these animals that are now hyperabundant. And then you take a plane from Africa to Amsterdam or somewhere, and then you trigger another you see the cascade of consequences from removing one element of the ecosystem, all of the ramifications that it has. That is a typical trophic cascade. What we see here, I mean, is a fascinating story of ecology, of food chains, but at the same time, we're illustrating a dramatic phenomenon there, the risk of creating another possible zoonotic pandemic episode, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And from my very brief research, my understanding is that because of factory farming, for example, I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but because of factory farming, one of the practices of factory farming is feeding the animals within the factory farms with antibiotics to prevent them getting sick. But now, as I understand, there's a resistance that is building within the animals, which is increasing the likelihood of zoonotic diseases, which is then increasing the likelihood of another pandemic.
That's an important digression and a little bit of a related situation, perhaps interesting for our audience to also visualize, is that with this trafficking activity of wildlife, we are moving animals from nature and putting them in markets, for example, as in the case of Wuhan market. And you know, some of these animals, for example, the famous pangolins, right, that are present in these markets because of the scales being presumably used for medical purposes and so on. Perhaps the pangolins, one of those was attacked by a bat, and that bat carried one alpha or beta coronavirus. And then people in those markets, just by accident, visiting those markets, buying those illegally, buying those animals that are not supposed to be being sold in markets, illegal trafficking, then the chances of us humans coming into contact with those pathogens. And I mean, in fact, this is still an argument, an ongoing argument, that perhaps the last pandemic, COVID-19, might have come from a bat transmitted to another animal that was in a wet market, such as.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very tempted to jump into the invasive species route. But I think before that, I think we'll structure the conversation a bit, because I think now we've laid a lot of good groundwork and theory and also concepts for people to understand in terms of the impacts that we're having on the environment, what we call that in terms of from a flora and fauna level, trophic cascades, and then all the wonderful stories you've told. So I think now I would like to just read 3 quotes. And one of them is from yourself, Professor, from a paper that you wrote called Biological Annihilation, which is a very tender title, but I think it really gets to the point of what you say. So you say in the paper, humanity will eventually pay a very high price for the decimation of the only assemblage of life that we know in the universe.
Yeah.
Your colleague goes on to say, in pushing other species to extinction, humanity is busy sawing off the limb on which it stands on.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I recently read Elizabeth Colbert's book called The Sixth Extinction, which we can dump into that term. And one of the scientists in the book say that the scientist was a herpetologist, and they say, I sought a career in herpetology because I enjoy working with animals. I did not anticipate that it would come to resemble paleontology, which is, as I understand, the study of the past, right? The study of past, of what's gone on in the past. And so I think these 3 quotes outline a very clear image that there's a decimation of animal life, and this is paying a huge price. And now that we have the idea of trophic cascades in our head and of a number of other concepts, I think we can understand how and why this is so critically important. So can you help us understand, you've referred in that paper that I talked about, you referred to the ongoing 6th extinction.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand what that is and what is the significance to biodiversity and life on Earth?
Yeah. So it is important to recognize that over the last 550 million years of life on the planet, a period called the Phanerozoic, the term doesn't really matter, but it's interesting because it's a Greek word that means the beginning of life, which is actually not correct, because life began basically almost 4 billion years ago. But for reasons that we don't quite understand yet, 550 million years ago, life began to be very explosive. The speciation, the diversification of the planet exploded at about that time. Well, since that moment, 550 million years ago to today, there have been 5 major cataclysmic mass extinction of life on the planet. So 5 times in 550 million years, okay? And we know that very well from the fossil record, from the paleontological studies, right? Checking fossils when they disappear from the fossil record, and then something else appears later on. So we know that in the past, there have been 5 major gigantic cataclysmic events of extinction. The most famous of those, the sexiest of those, is the one that occurred 65 million years ago, which is when a meteorite crashed with the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and that created, amongst many other extinctions, the extinction of the dinosaurs. And many other groups of plants and animals as well went extinct. So there have been 5 in the past. The most recent one, as I said, the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Since then, what we have seen in the fossil record and in the counting of biological diversity of the planet is that after that major cataclysmic extinction, life began to recover and to increase and increase and increase. So we are seeing now a relentless process of biological diversification again. But now we come into play. We appeared just a few thousand years ago on the planet. So we're one of the most recent species on the planet. But now we have the capacity to make the biological diversity that we have, reduce it because of the biological extinction that we're talking about, and we will elaborate a little bit further in a minute. It is looking that we're entering into the 6th event of extinction. 5 in the past that have occurred naturally in the absence of human activity. 1 which is different because we are another species. One single species is the driving force of that biological new mass extinction phenomenon. And hence people are talking about the 6th extinction of life in the last 550 million years of the life of the planet. But some people might say, well, if it's a massive extinction, how come that I don't see that every day another species of animal or plant goes extinct? Well, that process takes a little bit of time, so it's not easy for you to see. But we talked already about the local decline in the abundance of species. That decline leading to the geographic restriction of the species with a lot of populations that are disappearing. Eventually, when all the populations of a given species disappears, then you have finally the global extinction of the species. So it's going to take some time for the many species that we're endangering now to go extinct. But what we are actually seeing in measurable ways, the magnitude of decline and the local extinction of the populations. Because we know that, we've been measuring that, Xavi. Now we can estimate that in a relatively short time, if things continue as we are imposing now, as we're doing now, we might actually be moving into a 6th major mass extinction of the planet in the last 550 million years. You don't see it immediately in front of your eyes because the process takes a while. But the speed in which we are declining the abundance and reducing the populations here, and eventually you will have only one population. And if that population is only a few animals, then that population goes extinct and you have the extinction. So we're seeing the prelude of a mass extinction that might happen within our lifetime, comparable to the mass extinctions of the past, unless we do something about now.
Absolutely. And I'm tempted to give a moment of respite just so people can take that all in, because it is a lot if you've not come across it before. And yet I think it's very important to cover some of the fundamentals. So as I understand, Professor, the 6th extinction is occurring in many ways in different forms in terms of the causes. So one is the anthropogenic impacts, and we've sort of touched on that briefly. So the changes in land use and sea use. So the idea of taking land for agricultural purposes and consequently wiping away forests and tropical regions and even large amounts of seas for the use of food, which, given all the concepts we understand now, is causing huge cascades throughout the food webs.
Mhm.
We also have invasive species, which is, talking about COVID-19, the introduction of other species that are local in one area into another area, which is having big impacts. So I think a really great example is in Australia, there's a frog called the cane toad. It's a type of amphibian, which is essentially its population has exploded, being introduced to one area. And although not all species that are introduced into an ecosystem, as I understand, survive, the ones that do survive have a devastating impact because the local species have not adapted or have not evolved alongside that species. And so it can have a devastating impact, as I understand. But I'm cautious of talking on ecosystem ecology when I can just ask you about these impacts. So can you help us understand what are some of the biggest causes of the sixth extinction?
Yeah, fantastic. And this is really critical. To the point that we have been able to quantitatively measure the relative importance of the different anthropogenic activities and factors that we do, the one that seems to stand out, the most important one that seems to be evident, is what is called, in general terms, land use change, which is the conversion of nature into, via some kind of a use that we impose on that piece of nature, to a different thing, usually for productive functions, such as conversion of a tropical rainforest into cattle grasslands, for example. Imagine this conversion, shall we? A hectare of a tropical rainforest, say in Latin America, places that I know, say in Ecuador or in Peru, 1 hectare would have about 300 different species of tree, right? You want to cut it to produce meat for cattle ranching, you will cut all the forest, all of the 300 species of trees, and you will plant 1 species of grass. So you change from a multitude, amazing, fascinating multitude of tree species into 1 plant. So you create a monoculture. Why? Because then you introduce 1 animal, cattle, right? That conversion of a forest into a cattle grassland for ranching, that is land use change. Well, we now know, we have quantified that land use change, the conversion of nature into something different, which will not be able to maintain plants and animals, that is the main driver of biological loss, eventually biological extinction. The second one that comes into play is overexploitation. So let's imagine the situation. A tropical rainforest in Southeast Mexico, an area that used to be large in coverage, in extent, right? We convert that area into sections of cattle ranching, you reduce the area, right? By reducing the area, we come back to the problem that we talked about before. You're challenging species to maintain viable populations in that smaller area. But at the same time, Xavi, by reducing the area and creating fragments with process we call fragmentation, you are facilitating for the poachers and hunters and so on to have access into areas that in the past, because it was a huge forest, it was not easy or possible for them to have access to. So you have now the synergy between land use change and facilitating the incursion of hunters and poachers. So land use change per se is the most important driver, but at the same time facilitates another important driver, which is overexploitation. By having smaller areas, which makes the animals incapable of maintaining viable populations there, and at the same time facilitating the hunting, you are allowing for invasive species to take over in this much more simplified ecosystem. Because when you have many species, it's much more difficult for invasive species to take in there. Now you see the sort of the synergies, which are 3: land use change, overexploitation, and facilitation of invasive species. So what we're doing, Xavi, is we have sort of hierarchies in the magnitude of the impacts, land use change being the most visible one, followed by overexploitation, followed by pollution, followed by invasive species. But now what we are understanding is that all of these factors interacting in complex ways, in synergies, indirect and indirect effects and so on, that is creating all of this massive problem of of biological loss, deforestation, deforestations, and so on. But the problem is that we, even scientists, shall we, tend to think that if you study land use change, that is a problem. But if you study climate change, you say, oh no, climate change is a problem. What we really need to understand is actually quantify how climate change, land use change, pollution, invasive species, and overexploitation interact in complex ways to create the situation that we are seeing now in terms of the crisis of biological diversity that we see today. So typically we tend to think land use change on top, followed by overexploitation, and then the rest. But now we understand it is actually the interactive conjunction of all of these drivers of change that are coming into play in very complex ways, things that we scientists are not identified and quantified very well as of yet.
Absolutely. And so just to sort of summarize some of the ideas, so in terms of covering land use change as being one of the biggest causes of biodiversity lost, there's a few points to touch on. So firstly, as I touched on earlier, reducing the size of an area reduces the amount of species in the area. Right, so that's the first thing. As I
amount of species, and then for a given species, the number of individuals of that species, then moving into the genetic problems that we talked about.
Okay? Yeah, absolutely. So that first point. And then secondly, you touched on diversity. So in terms of ecological diversity, as I understand it, when there's an increased number of diverse species in a given habitat, it increases the security or it ensures that species are able to survive because there's an interconnectedness between each other, as I understand. Is that correct?
It's correct. The sort of the specific connotation there is as follows. The more species you maintain in a given area, the more diverse your location is, the better the functions of the ecosystems can be performed. For example, capacity to capture carbon and do photosynthesis and sequester carbon is better if you have many more species. Let's suppose that a disease is coming to a given location, and that disease, a pathogen, say a bacterium, a virus or something like that, if there's only one species, and if that species has low genetic diversity, then that location is going to be wiped out completely. But if you have multiple species, chances are that some of them are going to be resistant, right? It's just by pure statistical probability that some species are going to be resistant. And also, when a disease arrives in an area, if that disease attacks a particular plant species, it's going to be very easy to propagate that disease if the next tree is the same species. But if you have diverse species there, the probability of that disease expanding is dramatically reduced. So having more species, the functions of the ecosystem are performed better by the ecosystem. But then we humans, we take advantage of the function of ecosystems, and we call that ecosystem services, right? So more wood, more fruit, more pollinators, and therefore more production of seeds and fruit. So there is a very well-established relationship that ecologists have quantified, which is the relationship between diversity and the function of the ecosystem. The more species, the better the function of the ecosystem is. The better the function of the ecosystem, the better it is for us to maintain clean water, more pollinators, more animals that disperse the fruit, more resistance to invasive species, and so on. So that's the connection. It's called the BEF, biodiversity and ecosystem function relationship.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the eloquent summary. So we have that reduction in area that you talked about. We have the increased the reduction in diversity, and then also the overexploitation of a given area, which reduces its productivity and also such. And then the interaction of those other factors, such as the introduction of invasive species, pollution, increased temperatures from climate change, overexploitation, all of those things create a very big mixture, which is or a big concoction, which is very, very hard to understand and quantify and analyze because of its complexity, really. So you mentioned climate change. So a lot of the podcasts that we've talked about so far have been on climate change, with the desire to talk about biology and ecosystems. So I'm very glad to have you on. a lot of the focus in the media, as I understand it, and I'd like to hear your take, is that climate change is the biggest problem, and ecosystem, biological loss, deforestation, although it's always been present and in the background, it doesn't seem as to be the key, the big baddie, so to speak. But it's clear that if, even if climate change was to get worse, if there's no species to protect, then it doesn't matter.
An interesting way of putting what you're saying is for the people who are listening to our conversation. Let's come into grips with this very simple idea. We humans, we eat biodiversity, right? And just think about the supermarket. Those plants and meats that you see in the supermarket, they do not evolve in the supermarket, right? They evolve in natural ecosystems. And we humans have modified those to make them more palatable, more abundant, and so on and so forth. So we depend on biodiversity. We might be able to survive some decades, or perhaps some centuries with a horrendous climate, modified climate. Very low probability that we might survive in the absence of biodiversity, in the absence of oceans and phytoplankton capturing carbon and creating photosynthesis and releasing oxygen. Very difficult to very difficult to survive if the forests are completely clear and we don't have the capture of carbon and the photosynthesis that we depend on and the other animals depend on in the absence of biodiversity. So really, we depend on biodiversity. Now, to your point, it makes a lot of sense to me, Xavi, that people pay attention to climate change because it is so evident, it's so vivid. I mean, we feel it in front of us, right? Heat waves in the summer, fires in Australia, fires in California, many people dying of overheating, of heat exhaustion, things like that. Those things we see very dramatically in front of us. But I hope this is going to be interesting to see if people will respond to this conversation. I think that I would like to argue in front of our audience that is going to that perhaps climate change is obviously the sexiest of all global environmental changes, but it's not the only one, and perhaps probably not the most critical one. Biological diversity is really critical because of the reasons I mentioned, and also, Xavi, biological loss, biological extinction is an irreversible problem, basically. Climate, we might be able to do some things, especially if we really put our minds into addressing the problem, reducing carbon emissions and so on. We might be able to fix those problems. Extinguishing our biological diversity is going to be very, very tricky. Here's an interesting lesson from the evolutionary perspective, Xavi. We do know that those famous extinctions that we talked about, the 5 of the last 550 million years ago, I can assure everybody who's listening to us that life will come back after a major extinction. Why do I say that? Because we have seen it. After those 5 major extinctions, life actually came back to the same level of richness that it had before the cataclysmic event. It came back. But 2 things, and these are really critical things for our audience to come into grips with. 1, it takes millions of years to come back. We have calculated that for some vertebrates, the number of species that went extinct in a given time, dramatic loss, the number of species will come back to be the same after a little while, but that little while is about 10 million years. And I am not planning on being alive 10 million years after this to see the recovery of the biodiversity. And second, more critical, what comes back, Xavi, is not the same composition, is not the same identity that you had before. Think about this. The last extinction, 65 million years ago, all the reptiles and all the dinosaurs and many of the reptiles went extinct. Now we have many more species than that at that time, but it has taken us millions of years. And second, now we have a world dominated by mammals and birds, not by reptiles. So that's another way of me not having so much consolation, because 10 million years and second, what is going to be around me will be very different. So, that's a critical perception that I think we need to come into grips with. And finally, Xavi, perhaps a lesson that, an idea that might be interesting for us to share with with your audience is that this very commendable idea that we say that this exercise of a conversation with the idea of spreading the word and so on, because we want to save the planet, in some sense is kind of a myopic idea because of the following. We do know that the planet will come back. It will take millions of years, but it will come back. What we're trying to do is actually, the existential problem is humanity. The existential problem is for a given species, for a particular species that goes by the name of Homo sapiens. That is what we're trying to do, because I can assure of people who are listening to us, wait for 10 million years and life will come back. So you don't need to save the planet. The planet is going to be able to come back. But as I said, it takes a long time, and it's going to be a very different planet. We were to survive, we would have very different companions on the planet. Who knows what companions that might be?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think your idea is captured in the phrase of that book that I referenced earlier, which I highly recommend everyone read, called The Future Eaters. The story is tracing the first Australians, the indigenous population, arriving to Australia, and the story, the author tells a theory, which is, as I understand, they're still trying to figure out essentially how there was basically an ecological disaster in Australia, where once the first Australians arrived, a large amount of large herbivores ended up disappearing, and these were herbivores that were given the specific ecological conditions of Australia, where they were the keystone species in a sense. There weren't any large mammals. There was smaller mammals, but the larger herbivores were largely responsible for maintaining the plants and whatnot. And essentially, once the first Australians arrived, it's posited that they wiped out all of these large species, because these species never evolved with humans. They'd never seen humans before, and so it was essentially hunting ground. And the theory is that they've hunted them away, and then because there was no species to take care of the plants, to eat the plants, to the vines and whatnot, it caused an overgrowth, and that has led to Australia being a nation that is plagued by forest fires on a very large scale, which is incredibly interesting, the theory. And as I understand, is there's a lot of evidence to show that. In his book, he goes through that, but he coins the term that the Australians were future eaters, which is to say they consumed the future because of their actions in the present. They were able to feast on these large animals which they'd never come in contact with before, live great lives for the short term, but in the long term, ultimately, they caused a huge ecological disaster, essentially. And this is something that's been replicated in other countries like New Zealand, where the first New Zealanders, the Maoris, as they're called, when they first arrived in New Zealand, they came across these birds called the moa, which you may be familiar with. They're 3-meter tall birds that are, if anyone's seen the Disney film Up, it looks sort of like the dodo bird, not really, but sort of like in that sense, if you can imagine. But they found these moa, which translates to chicken, because it looks like large chickens, and they hunted these incredibly species away. And so the point of the book is to say, essentially, what state do we want to leave the future in? Do we, and I think as you put it, it's not if the world is going to end, it's the world will end. I think in Jurassic Park, they say nature will always find a way. But I think the question is, in what sort of state do we want to leave the world?
And how long it will take for it to recover. And we have 5 experiments that have proven that this is the case. The 5 major extinctions of the last 550 million years. So what you describe, Xavi, I think is really very important for you to have mentioned that book, because it seems to be that the thesis that the authors present there are very important and challenging and interesting to read about and to become aware of that. But that situation, since the last over the few thousands of years that humans have moved to an area where no humans, some dramatic changes have occurred. And this is a phenomenon that, as you said, has occurred in many parts of the planet, creating a phenomenon that we have not touched upon, but it'd be nice to mention, at least briefly, for people, the phenomenon of co-extinction. Let's suppose that humans arrived in Australia or New Zealand and eliminated the moas, right? Those megabirds were in turn the food of some predators, perhaps. And by you eliminating those birds, then the predators of those animals also go extinct because they have no food to. And not very well illustrated, but we do know, Xavi, that part of the cascade or the trophic cascade that occurs is because of this phenomenon of co-extinction. If the dodo goes extinct in Mauritius, in those islands of Africa, then the plants that were eaten by the dodo, the seeds, the fruit that were eaten by the dodo, that needed that part of the gizzard of the dodo for them to break the seeds apart and make them germinate, those plants will no longer be able to germinate because the agent of dispersal and manipulation of the seeds for them to germinate is no longer present. So we have many episodes of co-extinction when you see a phenomenon affecting one element that usually has cascading consequence by affecting other elements, and that in turn affecting other elements. Coming back to your point of trophic cascades that we talked about.
Absolutely. Look, I think there's so much more we can touch on, and I think perhaps the last thing we can do, and then perhaps we can have a conversation on another day, I would love to, is all the lessons we've learned. Okay, so we've learned a lot of things from the past mass extinctions. And how should we use those past events to inform our response today, if there is a way that we can sort of inform going forward?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that it is not completely irrelevant to insist in this perspective that we just talked about. We have a lesson that extinctions have occurred and will continue occurring on the planet. Mass extinctions are a rare phenomenon, as I said, 5 in 550 million years of time of life. So it's on average about 110 million years for a mass extinction to occur. One lesson is that in this particular case, is not a cataclysmic natural phenomenon. It's one species that is likely to create this mass extinction unless we do something about. But it's important to recognize that the planet will come back. So the critical issue here is the existential problem of Homo sapiens. That's really critical. Second of all, Xavi, seems to me that we now have begun to understand all of these complex relationships of ecology, conservation science, and evolution. But the way we operate as a society in the way of massive production in the short term, let's do deforestation so that we can plant oil palm for the production of oil, so that we can have colors in cosmetics and food with different colors and so on. Massive deforestation in Southeast Asia and so on. As long as we continue with this idea of growth mania, as we call it in one of the papers, grow at the expense of maintaining our livelihood now and into the future. That is going to be a way in which, despite the fact that we understand the phenomena, if we continue from the economic and social behavior that we have, that is going to make things very difficult. Another thing that we did not touch very much into, but I think after our conversation is going to make sense for the people who are listening to us, we do need, Xavi, to move into think carefully about a different diet for us in the following sense. There is so much waste of resources and food in our current societies that we could do much better. Just to give you an example, in the US, we citizens of the US, on average, right? I mean, in general, we eat twice the number of calories that we need, twice the number of protein that we need to maintain ourselves functioning well. That is to say, we're overusing, again, overexploitation, the resources. If we were to become cognizant of these problems and reduce the production of meat and have a more decent diet, a much more balanced diet, we will reduce the unnecessary consumption. At the moment, Xavi, the food that we produce at the planet level would be sufficient to feed everybody on the planet, but we see that that is not the reality. Lots of people have lots of food to eat and waste. Many societies do not have food to eat. So there's a lot of tremendous waste there. And so if we begin by modifying that horrendous waste, and then also to eat, to change our diets in a way that is much more sustainable, much more compatible with nature, we will reduce deforestation, we will reduce carbon emissions, we will reduce the problems of eating excess of meat with all the medical problems that we have. So I think, and kind of a general message that we can share with the people who listen to us is being much more friendly with the planet, being much more friendly with nature, and reducing that emphasis in growth at the expense of whatever, at the expense of the planet. That is an important lesson that we need to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And I suppose I want to take this opportunity, Professor, to ask you if there are any other actions that you have for people, because I was tempted to ask, but then I know the scale of the problem is such that although individual action is critical, it's also institutional action that is required. But at the same time, I want to give people a sense that if there is something that they can do, they ought to do it. So what else would you encourage people to do?
I would have maybe a sort of 5 or 6 bullet points that I'd like to share.
Yes, please.
One of them, which might not seem like a very relevant one, but I can assure you it is quite relevant, is precisely this exercise that we're doing, Xavi. Communication, spread the word. Because it seems to me that if we have a society that is better informed as to what is at stake, chances are that we're going to be able to pay attention to this problem. But, me as a scientist, I publish my scientific papers, and I do a significant effort in terms of going to public talks and conferences and so on. But we really need to communicate, spread the word as massively as possible so that society at large is informed and aware of what is happening to it. So exercises such as this is really critical. In particular, I am paying attention to the youth, because I think that the younger generations now, they function perfectly as ambassadors, because they can talk to their friends, they can talk to the parents and families. And if they understand these kids understand these problems, I think they're going to be fantastic elements in of this dream of having a much more educated society in terms of environmental problems. So that's one. Another one, we still have some natural areas that are in good shape in Australia, in Latin America, and so on. Well, those critical areas are precious at the moment. We need to protect them as best as possible. But it so happens that in many parts of the world, certainly in the areas that I work in Latin America, most of those areas are in indigenous territories. So we need to be paying attention to those local, rural, and indigenous peoples and the areas that at the moment they are conserving and protecting for us. Because if we want to restore, if we want to do restoration of areas that have been degraded, the elements that we will need for that restoration to occur needs to come from those areas that are still protected. So the protection of those areas that still remain in Australia, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and the people who live there is going to be an essential problem. It is going to be an essential activity that we can do. Number 3, this might seem a little bit tangential to our conversation, but I think is relevant. The better people in general understand this problem, when it comes the moment of election of new officers for, decision makers at the level of municipalities, counties, or even countries, or even United Nations organizations and so on, when we need to select and vote and elect people, if people become much more emphatic in asking these policymakers to provide an agenda, so how they're going to work in addressing these problems, because ultimately, policymakers will have the wheels and will be in the front seat, in the driver's seat, to help us address this problem. It's not enough for us scientists to tell what the problems are. We need the decision makers to be cognizant of this, but I think society can demand for those policymakers to be committed to these activities. next problem that I think we can at home address is we should stop buying wildlife products. How come that we still, in this age and time, we still want to buy ivory artwork when we know that that is killing elephants on a daily basis in dramatic ways, killing local people, eliminating the possibilities of local people to have their businesses such as ecotourism and so on and so forth. I mean, we should be able to live in the absence of those things. Furthermore, I see some hope because, some communities in China, for example, are now using cattle bones to produce those pieces of artwork instead of demanding to have elephants to be killed. So we should be able to do that, reduce the traffic and reduce the buying of wildlife products. I think we need to be paying attention to is the behavior in terms of the diet that we talked about. The more we move to a more omnivorous diet, not so much meat, definitely we're going to reduce the rates of deforestation, defaunation, carbon emissions, and so on. Then the problem of the population, this, in my view, is not only the numbers of people, but it's the very unequal way in which we use the resources. Some societies having a lot and wasting a lot, and other societies not having almost anything. So the waste comes with that. And if we want to tackle the problem of fertility of the human population, I think women empowerment, particularly in some parts of the planet where the women rights are so ignored or actually so obliterated, that is a critical issue that we, individually need to be very cognizant about and do things about. And last but not least, in terms of making sure that the people who are listening to us also feel that there's things that can be done. And there's many examples of things that have gone in a good way in terms of regeneration of forests, in terms of recovering of wildlife and so on. We need to appreciate and love nature because that's a treasure that we have obtained after, imagine this, after 4 billion years of evolution. I mean, it's an incredible evolutionary legacy. It's fabulous for us to be aware of that incredible legacy of the planet and be mindful about that.
Look, I think I couldn't have said it any better, Professor. I think on the last point of loving nature, my challenge to those that may not have grown up in areas that have been disposed to nature, or have been predisposed to nature, and perhaps you don't have that same affinity, I would still challenge you to think that the scale of the problem, the ethical and moral implications of not caring for the environment, even if you don't love it, are critical. And so even if it's not something that you care about, I think the case for acting is not only out of pure love, but also from ethics. And so I would encourage you all to do all the things that you've listed out, Professor, as I shall try and endeavor. As a last question, Professor, we ask everyone, I wanted to ask you what your utopia looks like.
Well, utopia by definition is something that is very utopic, but I think we can dream about combating the challenges that we have in front of us and have a utopian view that we can do things that can be fixed. We have done a lot of damage already, but there's still a chance of fixing things. And, we have to think also, it's not completely utopian. I think it's doable that we need to pay attention to the fact that we are borrowing the beautiful planet that we have from the next generations. So it is a tremendous responsibility, an ethic issue that utopian as it might sound, we really need to put our minds into that and engage and commit to that because we have this responsibility for new generations as well.
Well, I think we can end it there. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Muchas gracias, Rodolfo. And please stay with me in the green room. And thank you again.
Okay. If there's anything else I can do to help in your efforts to communicate these issues, just get back to me anytime.
Of course. And if anyone wants to find you or learn more about you, is there any way they can find you, Professor?
Yeah, if you go to the website of the Stanford University in the biology department or in the Earth Systems department, it's going to be very easy for you to locate my name, and then there's my website and there's my email. And then, you know, I also have programs for education for kids and so on. And so I'd be more than happy to accommodate a conversation like the one we had today, and a conversation for younger people, for children, and so on and so forth. And I'm happy to do that in Spanish and a little bit in Portuguese as well, and in English like today.
No, brilliant. Well, I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you so much again, Rodolfo.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.